So we're going to go ahead and get started then. So welcome everyone to our virtual launch of Conservative Newswork, a report on values and practices of online journalists on the right. The report was supported and published by the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University and by Columbia Journalism Review. My name is AJ Bauer. I'm a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication at New York University. I'm the co-author of the report along with Anthony Nadler, an associate professor of media and communication studies at Ursinus College and author of Making the News Popular, Mobilizing US News Audiences, as well as Magda Konieczna, an assistant professor of journalism at Temple University and the author of Journalism Without Profit, Making News When the Market Fails. The three of us would like to start off by thanking all of the leadership and support staff of the Tao Center for making this report, as well as today's virtual launch possible, especially Emily Bell, Katie Johnson, Hannah Joy. We'd also like to thank Pete Brown and Sam Thielman for thoughtful edits on various drafts of this report. Finally, we'd like to extend a special thanks to Susan McGregor, who shepherded this project from the start to finish, and we're really grateful for the keen insights and steady encouragement that she provided us along the way. So just a quick overview of the evening's proceedings. First, I'll be walking you through a quick overview of the report, its methods, its stakes, some key findings. For those of you who have already read the report or the executive summary, both of which are published online through CJR, I'm not going to be going into every single bullet point, obviously, in the executive summary, just highlighting a few key points, but I encourage you all to read, to the extent that you're able. So I'll then be turning things over to my colleague, Tony, who's our report's lead author. And Tony will be moderating a panel between three of our guests this evening. Nicole Hemmer, who's a historian of conservative media and an associate research scholar here at Columbia University. And two conservative journalists, Jeffrey Ingersoll, editor-in-chief of the Daily Caller, and Amber Athey, Washington editor of Spectator USA. One thing, just a programming note that you'll notice, at the bottom of your Zoom screens, you'll notice a Q&A button. We'll be using this feature to gather comments for a question and answer period toward the end of our panel discussion. Please feel free to post questions as they arise, and our moderators will pass them along to be raised by Tony at the end of the Q&A. So I think that should be all the housekeeping. Thanks everybody for attending, and I'll now proceed to kind of lay out a few findings from the report. Just one second. I think we're gonna screen share you. All right. So again, this is a launch for Conservative Newswork. It's a report that Tony, Magda, and I have been working on for about a year and a half. And so I'm just going to lay out a little bit of the context and findings, and then we'll move along to the panel. I guess I'll do the full screen. So first, some context. So partisan news is becoming more influential. This is not only evident in our day-to-day lives and in the election coverage and various other things that we're seeing, COVID coverage, et cetera, but also in the way scholars have started to think about what are the kind of crucial and moving factors within journalism studies and news media studies. I'm thinking here, for example, of Benkler, Roberts, and Ferris's network propaganda from 2018, which argues that there's partisan media is increasingly a dominant force on social media sharing platforms, especially, that played a particularly crucial role in the 2016 election. Arguably, this phenomenon has been happening or going back all the way to the end of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987. You can also argue that the internet and proliferating and cable news and things like this, but in any event, partisan news has become increasingly influential. Has been influencing why we turn to this topic. Simultaneously, there's been a broader reevaluation of journalistic norms taking place. Part of this has to do with kind of an erosion of what Dan Hallen once called the kind of high modern period of American journalism, which is kind of a post-war US phenomenon that foregrounded kind of impartiality, fairness, balance, accuracy, all of the things that we tend to look for in kind of professional journalism. In the last, say, 10, 20 years or more, especially with the rise of the internet and online digital media platforms, we've seen an increasingly tendency for various outlets, not just conservative ones, but various online journalistic outlets to be, reporting from a particular positionality, right? So even you see with, say, Vice or Gawker, R.I.P. Gawker, you see reporters increasingly writing from a subject position, no longer, kind of throwing away the impartiality and things like this, experimenting with new forms of audience address and things like this. So the phenomenon has been kind of emerging over the last decade or so, more than that, which has raised several questions that kind of are the kind of crux of our report, or the basis of our report. So questions like, should 20th century newsroom ideals be preserved? Is it time to throw out objectivity and balance and to form new relationships with audiences? This also dovetails with a question that Tony and I in particular have been really fixated on asking these last few years we just came out with an edited volume in the fall called News on the Right, which is designed to kind of raise the issue of conservative news within journalism studies and kind of interdisciplinary studies around news and journalism. But asking the question is, what is conservative news actually, right? How do we understand it? What's the history of it? What are the kind of contemporary phenomenon and dynamics of it? Luckily, we have Nicole Hemmer with us, a historian who wrote a very important and great book that provides some key historical context. We wanted a report that was going to be talking more with the contemporary context, and so we'll be talking more about that in the Q&A as well. So our study looks at identifying aspirational ideals within conservative news. So obviously this is or not obviously, now you know, it's an interview-based study. So we interviewed 22 journalists and editors at 14 online conservative news outlets. We reached out, we kind of did a cold call email reach out. We reached out to more than 100 news reporters and editors using just bylines and emails we found on Twitter and online. And I think it was 30 something organizations that we reached out to. Some questions that we were asking these journalists and editors: what guides their news judgment? How do they engage with audiences? How do they think conservative news outlets ought to operate, their kind of ideals? What is their assessment of how conservative news operates in practice? So the study is really geared at, it's almost a pseudo-ethnographic approach in the sense, at least with ethnographic interviews. The kind of limitations there are that we can only kind of tell you what folks told us, right? There are a variety of reasons why they might, feel shy to talk about certain things or other, but we feel pretty confident that we got some pretty straightforward answers. All of the people that we spoke to were very candid and very generous with their time, and we thank them all. Jeff was one of them, and there's many others that weren't able to be on this call as well. So next I want to lay out a little bit of the stakes of the argument. So this argument, our research here, is kind of a provisional withholding of judgment. And this is really important for us and for this report, insofar as a lot of studies of conservative media and conservative news preceding this, less so in the historical realm, but more in the kind of contemporary realm. So I'm thinking about the network propaganda, or I'm thinking about Echo Chamber, the classic Kathleen Hall Jamieson and Joseph Capella study. These are kind of sociological, in some way, analyses that are designed to say, how is conservative news causing problems in the overall information environment, right? And so it's starting out from a place of judgment. It's starting out from a place of having certain kinds of normative standards and imposing them upon conservative news. So we didn't want to do that. We wanted to take kind of a different tack. So our goal here is we're trying to understand conservative journalists' stated self-perceptions of their own work and the diversity of approaches within the field from their own point of view. The ideal here is that this is a first step towards developing a means of evaluating conservative news work on its own terms. Again, historically we've had, whether it's propaganda studies, whether it's other forms, journalistics and journalism studies, right? There have been a lot of attempts to kind of impose exogenous standards, normative standards onto conservative news, onto right-wing reporting. What we wanted to do was at least start a ball rolling towards developing what would a means of evaluating them on their own terms look like. So we don't actually arrive there with this report, but we hope that this report is kind of a first step towards additional kind of ethnographic understanding-based studies of conservative news in order to try to create that alternative standard of evaluative standard that then we can use for assessments as well. So getting into the findings. So some of the findings that are kind of perhaps the most interesting is some of the similarities that we found between conservative news workers and regular online journalists who don't consider themselves partisan or ideologically affiliated. So these include balancing news judgment with the necessity to engage with audiences, right? Vying for clicks in a crowded attention economy. These are conditions that face conservative journalists, liberal, progressive journalists, journalists who seek to be impartial in their reporting and presentation of material online. These are kind of structural forces that impact conservatives just as well as everyone else. Another kind of similarity that we noticed is that most interviewees describe their ideals as relatively similar to traditional nonpartisan journalism. This includes values like accuracy, fairness, valuation of well-sourced reporting and a depth of reporting. Oftentimes, a lot of our folks that we interviewed would complain, not unlike journalists outside of the field, right, that often depth and kind of well-sourced original reporting has to take a back step to audience engagement sometimes, right? Needing to get those clicks, sometimes you can't spend as much time on a story and things like this. These kind of dilemmas are dilemmas that conservative news producers face as well. The other value that stood out to us is similar to mainstream or liberal or progressive or other outside of the conservative sphere journalists, is this question of autonomy. So while conservative journalism often gets thought of as kind of a strategic communication, political communication, right? Conservative journalists do see their work as autonomous, right? Both as autonomous from the Republican Party or from the conservative movement apparatus, but also able to kind of, engage in robust debate and deliberation, either with folks who aren't conservatives or even debates within conservatism. So we wanted to kind of emphasize this just to point out that while a lot of times the conservative journalists tend to get lumped in either with strategic communication efforts, there's really a strong belief among conservative journalists that the work that they're doing is, that they do have a degree of autonomy, that they are having choice in terms of what kind of stories they want to produce and leads they want to follow, etc. So some other findings that we found that were of note. One is that there's no consensus on objectivity or balance within the field of conservative news. So we found a lot of divergence and difference within the conservative news field on this question. Some, for example, Hugo Gurdon at the Washington Examiner, have relatively conventional notions of objectivity and balance. So if you look at the Washington Examiner, if you look at the Washington Times, these are publications that do a pretty good job of segregating, right, their news content from their opinion content to some degree, right? They have opinion sections, for example. And so Hugo Gurdon explained kind of his view on this as that his outlet holds a forthrightly conservative worldview, but that he wants his reporters to write straight news, right? That he gave an example from his own experience in the UK, right? That like socialists would pick up his paper to read, what the conservative side thought and trust the kind of accuracy of that paper. So it's a privileging of accuracy and kind of not impartial reporting, so still reporting from a particular vantage point, but not necessarily kind of opinion pieces. Another example of this would be, so there are certain questions that a conservative journalist, for example, might think to ask of a labor union leader or something like that, right? That an impartial or progressive journalist might overlook either due to sympathy or sympathetic feelings towards the labor union, or in the case of an impartial journalist, just because they're not thinking about it or they don't have all that much involvement with it, right? So this provides, according to our conservative news subjects or interviews, kind of an added value within the overall news environment. Another kind of, maybe if you think about it in terms of polls, right? So conventional notions of objectivity on one end, the other end is kind of a radical subjectivity position. And so Breitbart's Matt Boyle kind of articulated this at last year's CPAC in a really provocative but interesting way, which is that he refers to objectivity as kind of the objectivity myth, right? And he calls for full ideological transparency, and he suggests that leaving things up to the readers, that readers can assess veracity of news stories based upon the authenticity and the transparency of the reporters and the outlets, right? So if I say I'm coming from a conservative perspective or background, that's my kind of lens that I'm applying to my reporting, that we can let the kind of audiences decide, whether my reporting ought to be trusted or not trusted. So this is kind of, there are a lot of views in between these two poles, but this is kind of the parameters or the boundaries of this question of objectivity or debates around objectivity within the conservative news field, at least these days. So the next kind of point to consider is this question of conspiracies, right? So most of our informants acknowledge misinformation and conspiracy reporting as a real problem. They weren't dismissive of it at all. They distance themselves and their outlets often and their sites from promoting fake news. So many of them said, this is a problem. It's a problem at other outlets. Our outlet actually has this figured out and we're not doing it, right? Or we're not promoting it. So the stress was the emphasis among a lot of our interviewees was that this is a problem that impacts both the right and the left, right? That there are conspiracy theorists on the left just as well as the right, and that often that the right gets kind of unfairly characterized as kind of a hotbed of these issues vis-a-vis the left. There was mixed responses in terms of how to respond to the problem of conspiracy theories or misinformation. David French, who was at the time when we interviewed him working for the National Review, downplayed the kind of gatekeeping capacity even of an outlet that's as esteemed as National Review these days. So if you look back to, say, the 1960s, where William F. Buckley was able to basically kind of say, well, the John Birch Society, they're a little bit on the fringe, we're going to leave them out of our out of our movement to some extent. These days, there's far less ability of any individual news outlet to gatekeep on behalf of the modern conservative movement like it used to be able to do. And so gatekeeping isn't necessarily something that conservatives felt like they could do to keep conspiracy theories at bay. There was a tendency towards a desire towards de-amplification over debunking of right-wing rumors. So one of the examples that we saw here was the kind of Seth Rich rumors that were going on around the 2016 election. A lot of our informants would say, so we didn't cover Seth Rich, for example, right, as a way of de-emphasizing or de-amplifying that rumor that was circulating among a lot of right-wing commentary sites, right? But there was kind of a reticence to debunk, partly because they felt that a lot of progressive and mainstream journalists were already doing a lot of that debunking work, and it wasn't beholden on conservative journalists to carry up that weight as well. There was, however, more of an emphasis on debunking left conspiracy theories and drawing attention to the fact that there were also conspiratorial elements on the left. A common example of this would be like the kind of 9/11 truther, 9/11 was an inside job, critiques of George W. Bush around Katrina and things like that. So that's the kind of findings regarding conspiracy theories. Other findings, many of our conservative informants felt that the mainstream news media treated them unfairly. So there was allegations of bias by media reporters as well as by scholars. Conservative journalists and outlets are seen to be held to different standards by the mainstream press by conservative journalists. They feel as though they're judged by mistakes and that they're given little credit for their successes. There's a sense that there's guilt of association going on, that there's an imprecise understanding of the field's boundaries and autonomy, an idea that, say, Trump is a puppet master controlling conservative news, or that, kind of really radical sites, for example, say InfoWars or something like that, being kind of used to kind of claim that the whole field is skewed in a certain way. Sorry, one second. Thank you. And so, again, the concern is that there's an outsized emphasis on conspiracy theorists and opportunists, less focus on the kind of real journalistic work that a lot of these conservative news reporters are doing, right? So one second. Lastly, this leads to kind of reporting challenges. So we did hear some reports from conservative journalists saying that there was difficulty accessing liberal and progressive sources. People wouldn't call them back, for example, in some instances, as well as some additional editorial scrutiny, that some sites require, additional citation or links, right, for things that should go without saying, just to make sure to cover their bases so they don't get accused of kind of misinformation. There's a question of quality. We heard from our interviewees that there's a lot of respect for mainstream outlets. Jeffrey Ingersoll, who is with us today, for example, spoke highly of the New York Times as being a very highly capable paper. There was another source that we spoke to said that a lot of conservative journalists see their ideal as kind of getting out of the conservative news sphere, maybe securing a job at a mainstream paper like the Washington Post or the CNN or something like that, because they tend to have wider visibility as well as better pay in a lot of cases. There also tended to be less esteem for other conservative outlets. So a lot of our informants spoke very highly of their own publication, but felt a little bit less clear about the standards of some of the other publications within the field. We're running low on time, so I'm going to move forward just a little bit more quickly. We have this question of ideological diversity. So a lot of the conservative journalists that we spoke to, there was obviously some preaching to the choir, talking to movement activists, but a lot of them saw themselves as engaging in a broader public. So the idea here is that they see themselves as part of a pluralist media or public sphere, and that conservative values and views in news is an added value within that public sphere. But few of them had a vision that somehow all of the media would just be reporting from a conservative vantage. So it's important to think that the conservative media, a lot of them are bringing kind of a pluralist approach to the table. It isn't that they're trying to take over the whole media, it's that they're trying to contribute their section or their ideas to it. So we noticed little outlet level sub-ideological sorting. Definitions of conservative varied according to our interviewees and were highly personal, so particular issues, particular ideological values. Most outlets practice a sort of ideological ecumenicism, allowing for debates within the conservative movement, not representing just one of the sub-debates or ideologies within it. The Trump factor, Trump and kind of the pro-Trump or anti-Trump sentiments have tended to flatten conservatism into sort of a binary. A lot of our respondents felt that this was a shame, that this was kind of flattening and disabling the ability of conservatism to engage in robust debates around issues and ideas, and that this was something that was kind of shaped by the contemporary moment. Finally, to conclude, at the very end of the report, for those of you who haven't gotten through all of it, at the very end, you might want to turn to the end. We've got 5 key dimensions for assessing editorial philosophies of conservative news outlets. The goal here is for scholars going forward that if you want to put together kind of maybe a mapping of, how do you compare these various outlets within the conservative news field? These are 5 kind of metrics that we put out that are possibly useful for that. So their orientation towards original reporting. So on the one hand, you've got folks like the Daily Caller or Washington Examiner who do a lot of original reporting. On the other side, you've got folks like the Federalist, other sites that are a little more opinion-based, right? So you can kind of map out the field of conservative media based upon how they answer that particular question. These other kind of dimensions that we mentioned here are other things that you could do to kind of be able to situate conservative media within that in a way that is, again, more rooted or less rooted in an exogenous normative judgment and more rooted in kind of the internal dynamics within the field, which is kind of the purpose of this report, to kind of tease that out. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Tony and our wonderful panelists. I'm looking forward to our conversation. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and we'll have time in the Q&A for more. Thanks again.
Thank you, AJ. So I think I'm unmuted now. Thanks. Great. Well, so yeah, thanks, AJ. And I want to just reiterate AJ's thanks he gave to everybody at Tao Center who's made this possible, both the research and the event. And now we're going to turn over to the next part of the event is going to be a panel discussion that I'm hoping is going to provide some deeper perspective and insight into the norms of conservative journalism, debates happening within that sphere. As we were soliciting interviews for this research, we got back a number of responses from conservative journalists who, in all cases I'm aware of, at least politely just told us, no, they're not going to talk with academics. So they didn't trust academics. And I don't say that to be flippant. I obviously I work in academia, so I'm coming from a very different perspective, but I understand the sense of unease that some folks have. And certainly conservative journalists are not the only ones who have this unease interacting and talking with academics. I really want to thank all of hopefully we have some of our interviewees out in the audience today, everybody who contributed to our research, who took your valuable time to talk with us, and a special thanks to those folks who are joining us on the panel today. So we have 3 panelists. If logistics and constraints were fewer, we could have an even broader array of voices. I'm really grateful that we have who we have. So first, we have 2 panelists who are themselves currently working in some leading roles at key conservative-leaning outlets. Amber Athey is the Washington is the Washington editor for Spectator.
It's Athey.
Athey, yes. Sorry, Amber. My apologies. Amber Athey, currently the Washington editor for Spectator USA, covering the White House, Congress, the 2020 elections. She's also a Tony Blakely Fellow at the Steamboat Institute and host of Daily Caller's Unfit to Print podcast. And before joining the Spectator, Amber was the White House correspondent for the Daily Caller. And correct me if I'm wrong here, Amber, but didn't you also have a media beat with the Daily Caller or do a lot of media reporting?
Yes, I covered the media for about 1.5 years before I started covering the White House.
Great. And Jeffrey Ingersoll is the editor-in-chief of the Daily Caller, and he graduated from Penn State University and then in his own words, quickly achieved, quote, becoming a Teach for America reject. He served in the Marines up until 2009, and he attended graduate school at NYU, studying journalism, long-form journalism and documentary. Jeffrey's reported from Afghanistan, Iraq, the Korean DMZ, and New Jersey. And Jeffrey, if I remember correctly, you also were the editor-in-chief at a military newspaper prior to going to the Daily Caller?
I was the managing editor at the Marine Corps Times, and then before that, I was the defense editor at Business Insider, and then
okay.
There's a lot before that as well, but those are the nearest two.
Yes, well, worked in an array of different types of journalistic institutions prior to coming to the Daily Caller. And our third panelist is a historian who can offer us a long view of conservative journalism in the US. Nicole Himmer is an associate research scholar with the Obama Presidency Oral History Project. She's a political historian specializing in media, conservatism, and the far right. She's the author of Messengers of the Right, Conservative Media and the Transformation of American Politics from University of Pennsylvania Press. And for any of us who have been following scholarship on conservative news, knows that this is a real landmark book and really just like an essential read for anybody who wants a deeper understanding of the origins of America's modern conservative media. So once again, I want to really thank all the panelists. Thank you especially for taking time in this, in the midst of this crisis to spend some time with us talking about this. I'll talk a little bit about how I want to proceed with the panel. We're going to start with several questions that I've shared with the panelists ahead of time, just to give them some time to sort of develop their thoughts on it. And then we'll take questions. And remember, the questions we're taking from the audience are going to come from the Q&A feature. So if you've got questions at any point, I really want to encourage you to type a question in the Q&A. Magda's going to be going through the Q&A questions and feeding selected questions to me. I apologize ahead of time. I'm almost certain that we're not going to be able to get through every question. I'm sure there's going to be some good ones that we have to leave behind. Say a little bit about my role as a moderator here. Certainly, I'm not here to serve as a fact checker. I'm going to probably interject a little bit with panelists to ask for expanding on things or maybe some details. And I really want to try to get all the voices in. I also really want to encourage all the panelists to please feel free to go back and forth with each other. Audience members, please grant us some leniency here as if things don't go entirely smoothly. I imagine that for all of us, this is a fairly new format. I know Amber is a podcast host, so maybe you've got a little bit more practice with this, Amber, but certainly this is a different format to be working in for most of us. So I will just transition into our first question. This looks at one of the research findings that we came across, and we found a tension among conservative journalists. On one hand, almost everybody we spoke with espoused some pretty traditional journalistic values: truth, accuracy, fairness to multiple perspectives, and a desire to be really a trusted source beyond just a committed conservative audience to a broader public sphere made of people with different political persuasions. On the other hand, a lot of conservatives feel very embattled as conservative journalists. They feel that the mainstream press is perceived as hostile, and that gives us there's a pull to take a more combative approach, to see conservative journalism as really a voice of protest and a counterweight to what they see as folks see as dominant liberal media. And this can certainly lead to a different approach than trying to sort of present all sides fairly in a more loyally approach of trying to present your side in its best possible light without triangulating everything. So I want to first start by asking Jeffrey and Amber, if you see this tension between the sort of we want to present everything as fairly as possible, and the tension with we see ourselves in a really combative moment. Do you see that playing out in your own newsrooms? Maybe I'd like to ask if you could talk about a story or a story that you cover where you've taken account of, well, here's how mainstream media is covering things, and that maybe you shape your own coverage in response to how you see mainstream media covering it. Maybe in particular, we could talk about coronavirus and whether at your outlets you're sort of taking account your coronavirus coverage in response to mainstream media. I also want to try to get Nicole in here, if you could at some point speak to if you saw this same tension looking at post-war conservative media activists, National Review, Clarence Mannion, others you write about, and how that tension played back at that time. So maybe Jeffrey or Amber, if y'all could start off.
I don't know, Amber, do you want to kick? I have a few examples, but do you want to kick this?
Oh, well, if you have examples ready, why don't you go ahead?
Well, okay, so I see our role as conservative media. First of all, it's not like this leads to an emphasis on less of an emphasis on representing all views fairly. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that there's this idea, even on the left-wing side, of something called false balance. And that means we need to cut out voices that we've decided are illegitimate. And so even in CJR last year, I was shocked when Parker Malloy wrote about, in CJR, she wrote an op-ed explicitly telling journalists to stop talking to parents of kids who were reticent about allowing their daughters to compete against trans women. And I was shocked. I have a respect for CJR as a matter of course, but I was pretty shocked that there would be a voice on CJR explicitly telling journalists to cut out a side. And so one of our roles as conservative media is to be corrective. And all we did in that case basically was there was a ton of stories about trans athletes that have been successful, and there was no coverage of the people that they had beaten. And that's all we did, was talk to we gave those people a voice. And then I think more recently, we've got an example of coronavirus related, I would say. So are gun shops non-essential? And you've got the wider media that basically treats this like this is absurd. Of course they're non-essential, but so you've forgotten half of the country. You're basically treating them like aliens. You've forgotten half the country, which is, to them, it's their Second Amendment right. And so all we do is give these people their own voice. So they get cut out of the media, and we just allow them to talk about how important this particular right is for them.
Just to clarify, so Jeffrey, that falls for you more under this senior outlet as the counterweight ideal of mainstream media is missing this, we're going to make up for.
Yes. So our two functions that differ us from liberal media are selection and correction. Selection being, if this story is undercovered, we're going to cover it. And correction being, okay, this story is being mishandled by the wider media, and so we're going to cover it in a different way. And most times that different way is to just include voices that have been summarily unincluded from the conversation. And to continue in a more wider scope, one big example is obviously Russia. Now, I'm a career military reporter. I think that there's a lot to report there, but the one thing that was really nagging me was the total lack of skepticism. And what I mean by that is that if it rhymed with Russia, they'd print it. And my understanding of a FISA was that, when you get a FISA, I'm aware of this because I covered surveillance. You get a FISA, that's a complete plumbing. That's all texts, all emails, that's phone calls, and it's searchable. Like you can search Google, you have like a searchable tranche of all these communications. And the one thing that kept nagging me is how come they didn't turn anything up? They got a FISA. They have all these conversations with all these different people, and they didn't turn anything up. And it didn't seem to me like the wider media was asking that question. And these are some of the best reporters in the business not asking one simple question: what did the FISA turn up? So we were a little bit skeptical. That's all it takes, is just a little bit of skepticism, and you can differentiate yourselves. And I watching the media cover it, I thought to myself, there's so many mistakes where a moment of skepticism would have added that one moment of pause that might have been the second that you recheck that fact, and you don't end up running something incorrect.
So just to clarify, so I'm curious, let's say about Russia accusations, did you feel like your job at the Daily Caller was sort of just to be that skeptical voice and insert the sort of skepticism that was missing in the mainstream media sphere, or certainly that you perceived missing in the mainstream media sphere? Or did you also want to make sure that your own audience, at least a good chunk of it, probably a fairly conservative audience, heard, the sort of most damning evidence and the best case that was out there to say there's problems here and with what was happening with Russia? Or did you feel like that's being covered by the mainstream media? I'm just going to cover that. I'm just going to sort of offer that counterweight or that skeptical voice.
I'm not sure I understand the question exactly, but can I take a shot at it?
Go for it. Yeah, sorry if that was a long-winded one.
No, it's okay. So there's a lot of when you're leaning so heavily into a particular narrative, there's a lot of exculpatory evidence that you either bury. So Reuters, I'd like to think that we write a story that it reads no differently than Reuters, except maybe we rearrange the facts. Okay, so which facts do we order the importance on? And we found, a bunch of stories that were simply buried. It was 8th, 9th graph. It hadn't been followed up on. And so, yeah, I mean, that's the skepticism. It's to bring out the details that we think have not been given a fair shake, I think, and to highlight those. And it's not a matter of defending Trump. It's a matter of we're trying to get at the truth. That is our job as reporters, and that's no different in any media company. So if we feel like the truth is being miscarried, then we're going to raise the details that we think need to be discussed.
Amber,
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think what Jeff hits on there is that conservative media probably wouldn't exist if it weren't for the fact that we were missing this entire section of people that don't feel like their views are represented in mainstream media. And conservative media fills this important role of being able to provide a voice to people who have traditionally been voiceless, in terms of places like the New York Times or the Washington Post or BuzzFeed News as a more recent example. In terms of the coronavirus, I think this is a great example of how conservative media can provide sort of a counter narrative in hitting some of the issues that Americans care about just outside of DC and New York City and places where journalists traditionally crowd in. There have been outlets reporting as fact, for example, that China has reported no new deaths from the coronavirus, and just taking that claim at face value. It's absolutely unbelievable. You have 5,000 urns being shipped to this hospital in, I believe it was in the Wuhan province, and yet somehow they're claiming that there's been no new deaths. There's also, of course, this other factor that comes out of the coronavirus crisis, which is American manufacturing. And that's not just a conservative narrative, by the way. That's something that people on the progressive left care about. Maybe Bernie supporters, for example, would like to see supply chains return to the US, but it's not something that's really been talked about in the media at large. So one of the things that I've been hitting on at The Spectator is, what does the coronavirus mean for the medical supply chain when we have such shortages of PPE because China was buying up masks and testing kits before this thing started spreading to the rest of the world. So you never want to be too reactionary, because you want to add value in other ways too, in terms of original reporting, and Jeff hit on that too in terms of story selection. Maybe we choose stories that maybe the rest of the media wouldn't touch just because it's not interesting to their readers, or their own biases cause them to look over that particular story. But yeah, I think it's definitely right that conservative media has a role to play in providing that balance.
Well, so I'm curious, Amber, if you could speak for The Spectator here. So like with coronavirus coverage, do you think does your newsroom primarily sees itself as, we want to provide the facts and the perspectives that we see the mainstream media not touching? Or do you say we want to provide that, plus we want to make sure even the stuff that's covered really well in their mainstream media, that our audience knows that, knows that too, that our audience gets those facts, those perspectives, if they are just relying on us or just relying on other conservative outlets? Like, which of those, just the counterweight, or counterweight plus I want to give you everything that's important on this story?
Right, and The Spectator is a little bit unique because we are primarily commentary based.
Mm-hmm.
So while we do breaking news and original reporting as well on a daily basis, we're publishing 10 to 20 pieces that are primarily commentary. So when we're writing about coronavirus, for example, we might have someone who's writing reopen the economy right now. We might have someone else who's urging people to stay in quarantine for another 2 months. And our role there is to try to provide a variance of perspectives, but they're always rooted in whatever the larger accurate reporting is. So that's always based in facts. We're not having crackpots come in and write conspiracy theories just because we want to provide a balance of opinion. We still care about making sure that what we're writing is accurate.
Nicole, could you offer some of your perspective on this?
Sure. Well, I think that the idea of selection and correction is something that has been embedded in conservative media from the 40s and 50s, from the idea that there weren't non-interventionist voices during World War II that were being heard, to there weren't sort of anti-communist enough voices being heard in non-conservative media. And from that very beginning point, there was this kind of dual relationship where conservative media was defined by a set of political values, but also was defined in relationship to other media outlets, right? That the stories they chose to cover, the way that they understood how media operated, it came out of their understanding of established media. So in terms of like whether you sided more with objectivity as a thing to strive for or the objectivity myth, for a lot of these early conservative media activists, they saw objectivity as something of a myth, that it was being put out there as a way of saying this is what journalists do, but actually they were pursuing a liberal agenda, and that needed to be countered by outlets that were pursuing a conservative agenda. And I think it's really important to understand that relationship, because I think a lot of people who look at conservative media from the outside tend to not understand that, and so they just judge conservative media outlets based on what they're reporting without understanding that they're reporting in conversation with non-conservative outlets. And so I think that's a really key thing to understand. And I think as far as, I thought it was a really good point about the Parker-Molloy argument in CJR. One of the things that conservative media activists have also really struggled with and challenged over the 7 decades or so that they've been around is trying to alter the line between what's considered legitimate controversy and what's considered out of bounds. Dan Holland got a shout out earlier in the introduction, and he's the guy who kind of came up with the sphere of consensus, the sphere of legitimate controversy, and the sphere of illegitimate controversy. And conservatives have often worked to take things that other outlets defined as illegitimate controversy and say, no, this is something that people actually do debate and do contend with, and we should be contending with this in our stories as well. So those are pretty long traditions within conservative media.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for perspectives on this. And obviously, again, I just want to remind everybody that as a moderator, I'm just here to sort of collect people's views and trying to hone in on as specific as we can get. So the next question I want to pose is that, in the past 4 years, we've seen we've seen Republicans are in power in many branches of the federal government, in many states, and I'm curious if you think that conservative journalism is different in a period where Republicans have control of a lot of the more conservative-leaning party has control of a lot of government. Does that environment change how conservative journalists conceive of their job versus a decade ago where Obama was president and there was a more of a mixed control? Does conservative journalism to each of y'all look different in a period where the conservative leaning party has more governmental power? What do responsibilities change? Maybe again, if we could start with Jeffrey or Amber, whoever wants to jump in on that.
Sure, I'll go ahead and start. To me, it doesn't really feel like my goals are that different, but what is a little bit different is the access. Just having an administration that is a little bit more friendly makes getting stories sometimes a little bit easier. In the Obama administration, conservative outlets would almost never get a question at a press briefing or at a departure, or even really have a friendly enough relationship with the press secretary to get basic questions answered. And this administration has just been more accessible. At the same time, as someone who's covered the White House for the past year and a half, I've also noticed that the Trump administration, contrary to popular belief, is really cautious of giving that perception. And in fact, still you know, they still leak things to the New York Times and the Washington Post, and they still are careful about appearing too chummy with conservative reporters because of this allegation in some outlets that Fox News, for example, is state-run media, or that Trump is just only giving interviews to conservative outlets. I just don't think that's accurate based on my own experience with working with the White House comm shop.
Jeffrey, could you chime in?
I mean, I think things have stayed generally the same. I'm not a historian of conservative media. I came up through New York City media. They wasn't really on my radar until I would say 5 or 6 years ago. I did read National Review as a kid. I never considered it conservative. So I wasn't that aware of it. I think it stays pretty much the same. I mean, it's all the cliches you can think of, speaking truth to power, whether it's concentrated power in media or government or tech. And here's the thing, there's been some pretty big targets since Trump has taken office. Now, we've done some aggressive reporting on Trump. We broke news on Flynn. We broke news just yesterday on acting NavSec Mobley. But there's also the media. There's also these huge media companies that are trying to use tech, in our view, to sort of squish the competition. And so those have been really big targets for us as well. And I can't say that would exist if Hillary Clinton had won.
So I'm curious, do you think your lens of like where you find concentrated power to investigate has sort of turned more towards non-governmental areas with a Republican or with a more conservative administration? And
me personally, or the Daily Caller?
I guess it's probably better to just ask you personally, to not put you in a spot as a spokesperson.
I have always been I was skeptical of surveillance and concentrated power in tech when I was writing for BI, and Snowden was a big deal. And it's only gotten more pronounced because it's just so weird, the pole shift that has occurred, because it used to be that the media was skeptical of these giant tech companies kind of, peeking in on the little guy, squishing certain people. And now, I mean, there was like a pole shift. Like I said, Trump won, and all of a sudden they were just like lobbying Facebook to destroy these people. And media was doing the same thing. And so it's been bizarre to watch, truly. And it's offered a real big target of coverage for us.
And if I could jump in as well, the media, in terms of being an area of concentrated power, that's existed for a long time in the eyes of conservatives. Even if the administration was run by Democrats 4 years ago, that just changed the tone of the media's coverage, but it didn't change their larger influence. So 5 years ago, you may have seen media critics on the right calling out people like Jim Acosta or someone at CBS, for example, of asking Obama a question about how he was feeling that day. And now instead we're calling them out for running stories claiming that Trump is to blame for a couple eating fish tank cleaner. So the underlying connotations of how the media is reporting about people in power may have changed, but their larger influence on the media landscape has not. And so that's always been a target for conservative media.
I do think that one of the things that you see historically, and it does vary depending on outlet and what that outlet's goals are, is that there's often a pressure to be more pragmatic when there are Republican office holders. So when Nixon is in office, National Review is much more restrained in its criticisms of the size of government. Now, they break with Nixon in 1972 because they can't stand his foreign policy anymore, but you see that with Reagan as well. There are some conservative outlets, particularly on the new right, that are willing to throw punches at Reagan, but many others do want to help support the underlying goals of the administration, and so are a little less punchy when it comes to Reagan. And I think there's also something about the fact that conservative media in the 40s and 50s comes out of this oppositional movement and forges an oppositional identity, opposed to the liberal media establishment, opposed to the liberal political establishment, a bipartisan consensus, they thought, on liberal policies, and has generally been more comfortable in that oppositional identity. It kind of loosed from the kind of pragmatism that sometimes constrains certain outlets during Republican presidencies. You see this a bit in the Bush administration as well, that when Obama is in office, suddenly those critiques of big government can come a little bit more toward the fore. They're there in some, though not all, conservative outlets in the 2000s, but once Bush is out of office, once his approval ratings dropped into the 20s, and then once he's out of office, it allowed a little bit more of that ideological opposition to emerge.
And another point I'd like to add, if I may, is that conservative media is also uniquely situated to come after a friendly administration from the right. A great example of this, just a couple of days ago, the DHS Secretary Chad Wolf was talking about issuing tens of thousands of agricultural visas in the middle of an economic downturn that's looking like it's headed towards a major recession, unemployment claims hitting close to 10 million. And there was reporting from Tucker Carlson that actually convinced the administration to back off of that plan and hold off until the fall. So there's space too to be critical of the administration, just maybe not from the traditional avenue that other media outlets might expect.
And maybe, Nicole, you could chime in on there. It seems like that is a long-term historical pattern of certain conservative media outlets really seeing them.
Oh, absolutely. That there's a role that they can play because they have more legitimacy, where they can pull the administration more to their position. It didn't necessarily work that well with Nixon, because Nixon didn't need conservatives as much as later Republican presidents did, because the base of the party became more conservative. But you see it in, just to go to George W. Bush, that immigration reform was an important priority of his administration. And one of the things that people in the administration said later was they didn't listen closely enough, in particular to conservative blogs. They were looking to establish conservative media, but weren't paying attention to new voices that were closer to the grassroots of the movement, and so did not anticipate the kind of grassroots base opposition to immigration reform. And that, I think, has led Republicans, both in Congress, but I think in this new administration as well, to pay a little bit more attention to where the base is so that they know what kinds of challenges they could face. And conservative media often acts as a good sort of megaphone for some of those concerns about conservative movement.
I just want to make a quick pitch to audience members. I hear that we have a few questions in, but we would love to have more. So please feel free to use that Q&A feature. I think you have to put the cursor at the bottom of the screen, because we're going to get to audience questions soon. I'm going to pitch another question or two to our panelists, and then turn to some audience questions. So many of the journalists that we spoke to, meaning the conservative journalists we spoke to, said that they didn't see other conservative media outlets as very reliable. Now, obviously, part of this is perhaps their competitors and talking themselves up. But I want to ask all the panelists, what conservative media outlets do you turn to regularly, and what outlets that you see as more liberal do you turn to regularly, and why do you choose those outlets? What are the strengths you see in the conservative outlets that you tune to, obviously, other than your own, if you're working for a conservative outlet, and what are the liberal outlets that you tune to that you see something of specific value in?
Firstly, I'd just like to ask, were these actual journalists who work in the news and break news, or were they the so-called never Trumpers at the opinion?
Certainly, we had some of those for sure, but I think a lot of them, it was certainly beyond the never Trump outlets that we got. Again, I realize there's a reluctance to sort of say, hey, this competitor in particular is doing a great job, and that's sort of part of the field.
No, I understand that, and I know some of some outlets in our field are generally, they enjoy themselves quite a bit. But I would say generally, Free Beacon, Breitbart is underrated. They had a few bad years. It's okay, but I think they're really good. Washington Times, Wex is really good. In particular, I like Reporters. Brandon Darby at Breitbart is excellent. I mean, he can run with any immigration reporter in this country at any outlet. And as far as liberal outlets, I read them all. I read CNN, I read New York Times, Washington Post, I read WSJ, although I wouldn't consider them liberal. I read NBC, I read all of them. I just think, it's in particular the national politics sections of these outlets that have become basically just cartoonish. And so you get guys like, my favorite reporter is CJ Shivers at the New York Times. He wrote a Pulitzer feature called The Fighter. Hands down, one of the most fantastic pieces of journalism I've ever read. He also, tracked ammunition from battlefields in sub-Saharan Africa to factories in China and Russia. He did all this stuff. And I highly doubt that today's media readers are even aware of it, because there's this cartoonish sort of, hell-bent figure on the left, this national politics blob that is sort of constantly drowning everything out. So I don't like looking at any of them as monolithic, liberal versus conservative.
Are there outlets that are openly on the left that you tune to, that you feel like these are the outlets, if I want to figure out, how are people making arguments from the left, I'm going to turn to, The Nation or, other outlets that you see as like a good barometer for what are the discourses going on the left right now?
Yeah, I think The Nation is pretty good.
I'm not doing a plug here for The Nation.
I saw a recent post from The Nation that I thought was excellent. I saw one from, in general, Mother Jones is okay. They're a little shrill. Yeah, there's definitely some. I probably avoid Think Progress, or I know they shuttered, or Media Matters for America. It's just too crazy for me to read. There's not much value there. I like to read actual news, so, but there have been commentaries on Mother Jones and The Nation that I've liked, and I think that part of that is just that there's same thing with The Intercept, in fact, and Glenn Greenwald is one of those folks. There's this sort of Venn diagram where the progressive left and the right, conservatives, sort of overlap. Like some of the Bernie bros, like Joe Rogan saying he would vote for Bernie, but now he's saying he would vote for Trump. And so I think that there's a shared set of values there, believe it or not.
And Amber, how about you? What are the outlets on the right and the left that you turn to? And what are the qualities that you think make these particularly engaging or interesting outlets?
I'm with Jeff. I read just about everything. I would say my morning routine would be, I read actually the Daily Caller's morning editorial email every day, which I'm sure is making Jeff really happy to hear. I read the Free Beacon a lot. I find their original reporting to be really fantastic. They recently brought in, of course, Eliana Johnson to take over the editorial duties there, and I think she's doing an awesome job. I will read Politico's morning email playbook. Of course, that's a standard for people in the industry. And then I usually read the front page of the Washington Post and the New York Times every single day. Back when I was a media reporter, I also used to do this dastardly thing where I would read all of the New York Times corrections every morning, just seeing what else they got wrong. But in terms of far left outlets, I actually do enjoy them quite a bit. Vox, I read a lot for their explainer pieces. I love reading Vanity Fair profiles. And Jeff is right, there's a ton of overlap between progressive leftists who have the same skepticism towards a lot of the same narratives that conservatives did. And Russiagate is a great example of that. Michael Tracy has gained prominence on social media for calling out some of the more insane theories surrounding Trump colluding with Russia. Glenn Greenwald was another example of a lefty who did that. Tim Pool has been taking on big tech bias, and he considers himself an independent now, but he supported Bernie Sanders. So I actually, in many cases, enjoy listening to people like that more than I do these standard bears in the media who are more establishmentarian and would be loath to criticize some of the common wisdom.
Nicole, how about you? Where do you turn, especially I imagine like in the contemporary sphere, where do you turn right and left for?
Yeah, so my reading habit is probably more conditioned by wanting to get a sense of what the broad spectrum of conservative thought and opinion is. It used to be like, I look at national reviews, The Corner, when the blog was a little more active and a little more read. I would read Breitbart a lot. I would read Red State a lot when it was under Eric Erickson. But in particular, I would go to those sites because if you went into the comments, you could kind of see, if you could put on a good filter, you could kind of see where people were pushing back, what they were latching on to, and get a better sense of what the conversations were that were happening. Since the 2016 election, I've added to that more of like the American conservative to get some paleo-conservative views and see how they're framing things. And so I just try to read kind of broadly to get a sense of where the different conversations are. So not just straight reporting, but a lot of commentary as well. And then as far as, I do less reading on the far left, but I think that I would agree that Mother Jones, New Republic, The Nation, if you want to go to like Jacobin and Dissent, if you want to get more of those meatier, sometimes more economically rooted or class rooted analyses. But one of the things that kind of came up, this idea that you're reading particular people instead of particular outlets. I mean, I think that disaggregation of writer or journalist from outlet is happening on the right just as it is throughout the rest of media. So a lot of it is about too how you construct your Twitter feed, right? Like who are the conservative voices that you're listening to there, because they will push you out to conversations that are being had and to publications that might not make up your homepage in the morning if people have homepages anymore, but do sort of like point you to various conversations that are happening for outlets that you might not generally think of or read, but have something interesting filtering up.
Great. Well, I'm gonna start working on some audience questions, and it's gonna take me a little while just to process them based on the channel I've got incoming. So I want to throw one more question out to panelists, and my apologies if I'm looking at the side of the screen for the rest of this. So a lot of critics see polarization in our current environment as a problem, and in particular, what political scientists sometimes call affective polarization. So there's a lot of almost like an emotional loathing for what's perceived to be the other side that sometimes supersedes actual differences in issues or in policies. I think in short, a lot of people, critics from both left and right, see the other side as really participating in demonizing. So that critics on the left see the right demonizing the left, seeing right demonizing groups that the left stands for. And certainly many critics on the right see the left as demonizing figures on the right. I'm curious, and this one is mostly for Amber and Jeffrey, although Nicole maybe could provide a historical perspective on this as well. If at your outlets, do you feel there's some kind of responsibility that, okay, we're on the right, and we've got to try to not demonize the other side? Or, do you see demonization as sort of a normal part of politics and raising your audience's ire at the crazy things that happens on the left? How do you think, do you feel a sense of responsibility at your outlets that demonization is a problem and we've got to do something to try to, demonization and polarization, to try to tamp it down? Or what, do you have conversations about this at all at your outlets?
At the Spectator, not really.
Okay.
Our reader base is a little bit different than a traditional conservative news outlet. They're a little bit more interested in long form commentary and therefore probably aren't as likely to be able to be outraged at the other side, regardless of what type of commentary that they're reading. But I think generally speaking, there is this perception that's not necessarily true, that conservative outlets are trying to gin up outrage from their readers. I don't think that's accurate. I think that people on the internet just kind of suck sometimes, and that's regardless of comments on the Daily Caller or comments on Vox. People just let all of their emotions unleash on the internet because they feel like it's a safe space for them to do so. And I don't think it's fair to expect any reporter on either side to try to draw back their reporting or pull back their reporting or their criticism and their commentary to try to tamp that down, because I think that's more a function of social media and the larger culture than it is particular outlets or reporters.
I would absolutely agree with Amber. One thing I tell young writers is that you don't have to help our audience. And I'm not one to sort of ban words or anything like that, but I do warn new writers not to use the word liberal or leftist in a headline like a pejorative. And this is like, new guys that we just hired. And it's also, you know, I hate to be a little critical, but it's hard for me to take the question about us having responsibility seriously when we represent like 5% of the body mass of media altogether. And the one example I could think of is when the New York Times had to change its headline. It was an internal revolt, and it had to change its headline on Donald Trump. You know, unity versus racism was Donald Trump's message. And it was particularly striking to me because Dean Baquet, he's been a grown black man for 4 decades, and he's got to hold an internal town hall because the youths, the new hires at the Times, believe that the paper is giving Trump a pass on racism, and they want to lecture him. And so I think there was a moment there where Dean Baquet could have said, no, this is the right thing to do because this is the objective truth, or as close to objective truth as we could get. But instead, he was cowed. And so I think, you know, internally and externally, there was a moment where he could have not demonized, and they chose the other route. And so I think the responsibility is mostly on them.
But just to clarify, you based on the headline issue you talked about, you do feel there's some responsibility on your side that you want to sort of draw back from?
I mean, I do not. I want the reporting to speak for itself, and my reporters know this. So we're not going to use partisan language as a pejorative, you know, all caps liberals exclamation point in headline. We're just not going to do that. One, because if the story is interesting enough, you don't have to do that. And two, you don't have to help a conservative audience to, you know, disdain Vox Media or the legacy media. Like you don't need to help them dislike Hillary Clinton. So there's no need to go that extra mile. You just report it as is, and you let them make their own decisions. And also, by the way, I want to second what Amber said. The internet is just a nasty place, and people are going to take things and take them to the extreme there. So, yeah.
And Nicole, if you could jump in on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's surfacing something that has changed a lot for media in general and conservative media in particular. And that is that it used to be that there were different political economies for conservative media versus this more mainstream established media, and different sets of values, that there was a commitment at least to strive towards objectivity among mainstream media, to sort of give a voice from nowhere with no emotions or no, I don't want to say no clear moral values, but to seem sort of objective and detached. And I think that has changed. I think one of the things that we're seeing are these challenges to those old media values in established institutions where you do have these reporters and headline writers and editors at places like the Times and Post who want the paper to take a clearer moral stance, whether it's in headline writing or tweets or in stories themselves. But as far as the political economy of it, I mean, all media outlets are pressured by a political economy that privileges clicks, right? And clicks are driven by emotion. And the emotion that is easiest to gin up is often outrage. And so there's a balance that has to be struck. And you mentioned this in your report, but I think it's true for non-conservative media as well, that trying to balance the deep, important reporting and ideas with the headline that drives a lot of traffic to the site, because they're both ad-based. Back in the day, conservative media outlets tended to be funded by sponsors and more reliant on that model than on things like ad revenue. And now they look much more like, at least in terms of revenue, non-conservative media.
Well, I'm going to turn to a couple of audience questions here. So we've got about a little bit over 10 minutes left. I'm hoping to be able to hit a few of these. And my apologies if I butcher them here. But this one, I believe, comes from Monica Guzman. I'm a journalist myself, and I've always been mystified by how rarely I see conservative and more mainstream liberal journalists network and share best practices, or even go and hang out at the same conferences, despite the fact that we share so many values and goals. The vibe I get is that fellow journalists is that building stronger connections between these two groups is impossible or just not valuable. What do you think? Is there opportunities to build bridges between journalists working on the right and journalists working outside of the right sphere, whether mainstream or openly left or liberal journalists? Amber or Jeffrey, would you be interested in, what are your contacts like right now with journalists outside of the conservative sphere? And do you wish them to be otherwise? Do you think there's opportunities to deepen those relationships?
I definitely am personally friends with a number of more liberal reporters, but at the same time, I've noticed that sometimes when I do attempt to reach out or talk to someone or be pleasant with someone, I don't get the same level of respect in return. This has happened in the White House press briefing room, for example, where I just sometimes am brushed off by people who I don't know what their motivation is. Perhaps they see themselves as maybe at a higher station because they're working at a more established newspaper, or they just are worried about what their peers will think of them if they're associating with someone who labels themselves a conservative. But it's definitely a problem that I've noticed. I think the White House Correspondents Association, at the very least, is trying to change this in some sense. They've been having these monthly happy hours with reporters who cover the White House and events like that in order to get us all in the same room. But it can be difficult just because I think the same political motivations that perhaps drive relationships out in society are happening in the media world as well.
I think too, there have been historically like different institutional supports for conservative journalists and conservative commentators that exist separately from other more established journalistic institutions. And so what ends up happening is that people come up in different spaces. And so they might end up forging social relationships, but not necessarily having common professional institutions and ties. And so that can also create some barriers as well, just because they're trained differently. I mean, there was a project within the conservative movement to create an organization to train conservative journalists, because they thought that that training would be better than you would get at like a journalism school, that conservative ideas wouldn't be welcome at a place like Columbia Journalism School, and so they would have to get trained elsewhere in order to be good conservative journalists.
And the Daily Caller News Foundation, I know, does. And I think Jeffrey, you've worked with the training program before you were at before you moved into the editorship of the Daily Caller.
I basically helped set it up and then ran it.
Yeah, and I know National Journalism Center is maybe another one of these institutions.
They do one, and I think National Review might do something similar.
Yeah, and the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, ISI, has a collegiate network fellowship and internship as well, where they place young conservative journalists at partner organizations.
It's actually a completely different pipeline, and it might even be worthy of its own study, where all these people come from. I came up through the New York City pipeline, which is how places like CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, how they staff. So I mean, it's worth its own study, I think.
Okay, I got lots more good questions coming from the audience, and again, my apologies. Now I actually am not sure. And there are some names, but I don't know. I'm having trouble matching which name, so I'm probably not going to say the names of the folks who asked these questions. One question is, do you all see, especially for Jeffrey and Amber, are there outlets out there that you see outside of the liberal conservative dichotomy? Are there outlets that you see as sort of politically unidentifiable as having any particular bias or leaning?
Oh, that's a great question.
It is a good question.
Do you have an answer, Amber?
Do you consider The Intercept to be one of those sites, or do you see
I
as?
think they're left of center. I would say, I hate to tout one of my old employees, but for a while, Military Times, military.com, I think it's more of a kind of a beat thing. If you look at in the national security section of the New York Times, for example, I think it's going to be a little less politically biased. It's also a reporter thing. So I'm not sure if there's one in particular that I would say, maybe Reuters, but even as of late, post 2016, they've gotten a little shaky in my opinion. AP, The Wires, I would probably have said 4 years ago, but I think the situation has changed.
Yeah, I agree. I would have said The Wires, but I've seen some headlines or behavior on social media recently that would suggest that's not accurate.
I'll throw one for you. How about The Hill? How do y'all think of The Hill as a publication?
I mean, I don't know. Amber, do you want to go?
Yeah, actually I guess The Hill's not really a bad example. That would probably be the closest that I could think of to relatively centrist. But I also haven't seen that much original reporting out of The Hill recently. It seems like it's a lot more commentary based over the past few years. And then they had that whole skirmish with John Solomon over the Ukraine reporting. So they're just difficult to pin down.
Another question, and again, apologies, I'm not sure who sent this question. So a lot of the folks we talked to, in the conservative news sphere, said they wanted to reach audiences that were liberal audiences or at least non-conservative audiences. I'm curious if Jeffrey and Amber, if you could say, is that a goal at your publications? And if so, how do you measure success? What kind of feedback mechanisms do you have to know if you're reaching, audiences outside of, fairly committed conservatives?
I think it's always nice to talking over each other now, but I mean, I definitely still am thrilled if my reporting gets cited by the Washington Post or the New York Times or AP or any of these other outlets, not only because it's good for me professionally, but also because it shows that people beyond just the conservative audience are paying attention to this reportage and think it's important and interesting. And if we were just speaking to the same echo chamber over and over again, then we wouldn't be adding that much value to the media landscape. The whole point of providing a counterbalance is not just to give a voice to the voices, as I said earlier, but also to hopefully expand those ideas to a new audience that might be receptive to them.
I know that we get read by independents and liberals. Perhaps some of those liberals are hate reading us off of Facebook, but I've seen the demographics before. I know that we have a pretty even split between sort of all those three.
Is it Nielsen, or Nielsen's or a metric service that helps you figure that out?
I'm not exactly sure.
Okay.
That's the business department, like the ad department. I just know that of what I've heard. As far as gearing stories, I just think if you tell an interesting story or you have an interesting headline or there's something novel, people are going to read it. And so, we did an investigation into the Sacklers, and I'm not sure if you guys know who they are, but they're the billionaires, the billionaire pharma people who are sort of in legal trouble now. And that's not really sort of a partisan story. And we were a runner-up for an investigative journalism prize from the DC Society of Journalists. And so we know people read that story, presumably not just like this teeth-gnashing, sort of conservative middle America audience. And we can see that with all sorts of different headlines and stories and whatnot. We know they get passed around.
Yeah, and the Spectator broke a story just 2 weeks ago about how Jared Kushner was apparently seeking advice on the federal response to coronavirus from Karlie Kloss's father, who happens to be I think he's a trauma surgeon. So that story got widely shared by leftists on Twitter who, want to use it to bash the Trump administration. And we're fine with that. I mean, news is news. You can use it however you want. So we were glad to break that story and glad to see the traffic that it got.
And Cole, I'm curious if you could speak about how, how the National Review or Clarence Mannion or the post-war activists sort of thought about speaking to, like, who did they envision? Did they want to speak to audiences beyond committed?
Well, at first, they really just wanted to talk to other conservatives because they felt like conservatives had no voice and that they were so spread out throughout the country that they felt alone. And one of the big projects of early conservative media was to say, hey, you're not alone. Here's a place where you can see your views reflected. And then, after Barry Goldwater lost in 1964, they were like, oh, we have to find a way to expand this. And actually what ended up happening was a lot of the ad revenue and sponsorship dollars started going to state and local media as people began to think, oh, we need to build this movement and its political power from the bottom up. And so there is kind of this period in which it's difficult for conservative outlets to reach anyone. But they do, I mean, it becomes more read, I think, in the 1980s as it's seen as influential within the Reagan administration. And so people are like, oh, if Reagan is reading Human Events, we need to read Human Events just to know like what ideas are out there. And then I think, you know, moving on to today, that, yeah, I think particularly pieces of reporting and analysis that break out of what are perceived as traditional partisan issues. And I think on things like criminal justice, you see this a lot more. There's a lot more cross-cutting. And social media actually makes it easier for there to be this sort of boundary jumping, because again, the stories are often divorced, at least to the person who's about to click on something, from the publication itself. Like they don't necessarily know the ideological bent of the publication they're clicking on. They're just interested in the story. And so that creates actually a lot more opportunities for something to be read more widely.
And by the way, I believe that question was from Todd Gitlin. I'm getting a correction here. So thanks for that. Good question. One last question so that we don't get, I think our webinar is going to be cut off at 7:30 and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time just to ramp down. So I'll throw, if this is too big, let me feel free to push back on this. One of the audience members is asking, what would you say to readers who are skeptical, I assume it's especially for Jeffrey and Amber, what would you say for readers who are skeptical of the motives of conservative media? Obviously, I think a lot of non-conservatives see conservative media as is simply a kind of advocacy and willing to use information in whatever way they see it as advantageous to their cause, rather than trying to tell a story of what's going on. Yeah, what would you say to those who approach your outlets with that kind of skepticism?
Jeff is probably better suited to answer because he's been in the media longer and was not in conservative media for a large part of it.
I'm sorry to throw a big question right at the end here.
I would say that you need to judge each story on its own merit. That's extremely important, and I think one thing that we've lost with media literacy, and perhaps this is Walter Lippmann's doing from a long time ago, is just the idea that we should just believe everything we read, and I don't think we should. I think skepticism is healthy. I think everything that you read, you should apply a skeptical eye to. And I don't think, in particular, as I outlined with the New York Times and CNN, there's a lot of people, I have friends who work at CNN. I watch CNN. I think their documentary unit is great. There's a couple of anchors I like. I'm going to treat every piece of information that I see the same. I'm going to have the same skepticism. And then, if Jake Tapper says something I don't necessarily agree with, that doesn't mean that I suddenly, Jake Tapper's a wash. So I think you need to take each bit of information, each post, each story, each soundbite, you have to judge it on its own.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I might go 1 week from bashing a CNN story because they, got this reporting wrong on Michael Cohen and Trump Tower, but they could have a very well-sourced, good report the next week. And I'm not going to find the entire outlet for this one mistake. I might be more skeptical than I was a week ago of every story that I'm reading there, but I'm also not going to say that the entire thing is fake news or that every reporter there is fake news. I just don't think that's fair. I expect the same type of, that the same approach should be applied to conservative media. And one other,
you use the term fake news, by the way. Like, is that a term you?
I use it, but usually ironically, just because it's funny. But I'm not in the way that the president uses it usually. But one other thing that I think people do a lot with conservative media is they mix up the opinion section and the reporting section, which is really frustrating. And I have to point this out just because it's bugging me. I do have the Q&A open, and there's a comment from Garrett who's suggesting Jeff contradicted himself because there's a headline with the word liberals in it, but it's an opinion piece. So it's just like, this kind of stuff drives me crazy. This is like clearly an analysis piece from Derek Hunter, who has a podcast on the Daily Caller. So I think people should be a bit more careful about, if you're going to criticize an outlet and suggest that they're biased, make sure that you're looking at the actual news reporting. That's the same. We wouldn't fault the entire New York Times for publishing an opinion that we disagree with.
I do think that those lines tend, go ahead.
The New York Times just blamed coronavirus on evangelicals. I mean, technically speaking, but it was someone who wrote an op-ed. I can't say that the New York Times editorial board holds.
So I think we are actually all going to get cut off in 3 minutes. I just want to, obviously there's a lot more to talk about here. There's a lot of issues that have come up that we've sort of skipped over very, very quickly, but I'm hoping this was a productive and valuable dive into at least the different modes and approaches that folks coming from different parts of the media sphere are thinking about here. I want to thank, first of all the panelists, Nicole, Amber, Jeffrey. Thanks a lot for spending this time with us. I can only imagine that this is a really busy time on everybody's end. Thanks to all audience members who have taken the time to spend, to take part in this event. I hope we have a chance to follow up on this more. I also want to thank Susan McGregor, the Tao Center, Hannah Joy, who's really been behind the scenes here and has kept us running. So yes, I hope we're able to continue this research, this conversation. And thanks a lot to everybody who's been able to join us.
Can I just say, I see a bunch of comments here. I didn't know I could read the comments.
I didn't know I could read the comments even, Jeff.
My email is public. You can find it. Just Google me. It's right on my Twitter page. I see some stuff here about conservative journalists of color and identity politics. If you're curious what I think, go ahead and email. I'm one of the most accessible EICs in the district. Go ahead and email me. I'll answer any questions you have.
If you CC me, I'm interested. I definitely need responses.
Same here. My email address is on my Twitter bio as well, and I'm happy to answer any further questions.
Great. And and same. I think all of us researchers are also interested in carrying this conversation on. So thanks a lot, everybody. And again, thanks a lot for all your generosity of spending time here on a day like today. So take care.
Thanks.
Really appreciate it.
Bye.